All right, everybody ready? Today we are diving into a topic that I have to admit I didn't know a ton about before we started researching.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one for sure.
We're talking, of course, about the surprisingly complex world of Beetlejuice.
Right.
I mean, you hear Beetlejuice and you kind of think, like, one thing.
Right.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
think you know what you're going to get.
But as we're learning, it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds.
Not at all. I
Uh,
mean, even the definition of beetle juice can totally change depending on, like, are we talking about defensive fluids that beetles produce?
yeah.
Culinary uses. There's a lot to unpack there.
Okay, so, like, when we talk about the actual stuff beetles themselves make, like, what's the deal with that?
So many beetles, right, as a defense mechanism,
Hmm.
they secrete these fluids, and they can be, incredibly bitter, pungent. Some of them can even, like, irritate your skin.
Yeah.
Definitely not something you'd want to just, like, casually sip on?
Yeah, no kidding. Sounds like something straight out of a superhero movie. Like, some kind of defense spray.
Exactly. And it's like fascinating how these insects have evolved these chemical defenses over time. But yeah, when it comes to taste, safe to say, probably best left to the beetles.
Duly noted. I'll stick to apple juice, thanks. But okay, there's this whole other side of Beetlejuice we got to talk about, right? Like beetles as a source of flavor. Now that's where things get really interesting for me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For centuries, different cultures around the world have been incorporating beetles into their traditional food and drink. And it's not always about eating, like the beetle itself, right? It's about the flavor they can add to things.
And you mentioned mezcal before we started recording. I'm kind of dying to know more about that. What kind of beetle are we talking about? And how does it end up in tequila's, like, smoky cousin?
Okay, so first, it's not actually in tequila. We're talking mezcal here. Specifically, a variety called mezcal de gusano, that worm you sometimes see at the bottom of the bottle. That's actually a larva, and it comes from a type of moth, not a beetle.
Wait, a moth? I thought we were talking about Beetlejuice. See, this is what I mean. It's more complicated than it seems.
Right, it's a common misconception. But it actually highlights how diverse the world of insect-derived flavors really is.
Yeah.
Even though it's a moth larva, not a beetle, the principle's kind of the same. They roast the larva and add it during the distillation process, and it gives the mezcal this really distinctive, smoky, earthy flavor.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Like almost infusing a spirit with some other kind of flavor, like fruit or herbs. But I mean, insect larva, that's next level. So it's more like the beetle, or, well, insect in this case, influences the flavor rather than us actually drinking straight up beetle juice.
Exactly. And this whole idea, right, of using insects in food, it's called entomophagy. And it's been a part of cultural traditions for a long, long time.
Right. And we're hearing more and more these days about, insects as a sustainable food source, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, is that connected to these traditional practices at all?
Oh, totally. I mean, for many cultures, insects have always been a part of their diet. Like, there are certain species of water beetles in Thailand, for example, that they harvest and dry and grind into this powder that they use kind of like a seasoning.
Hmm.
Gives this savory, almost umami flavor to food.
See, that's so interesting to me. Like, something that I'll admit, weirds me out a little bit is just a regular part of life in other parts of the world. It really makes you think about, like, how much our own ideas about food are just, like, cultural, you know?
Totally.
So, after all this, right, this whole deep dive into Beetlejuice, where does it leave us? Like, what's the final word on the taste test?
Well, I think it's safe to say that beetle juice, like we said, it's not just one thing, right?
Mm.
From these defensive fluids that are best avoided to, like, centuries-old culinary traditions, it's clear there's a whole lot more to Beetlejuice than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And I think for me, it's a good reminder that sometimes, the things that seem kind of strange at first can actually be a window into a whole other world. Like we talked about history, culture, even like a future of food.
Right.
So if any of our listeners are ever like offered some mezcal de gusano, maybe don't say no right away.
Yeah. Be open-minded.
Approach it with a sense of adventure. Who
Yeah.
knows? It could be your new favorite thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
New culinary experiences, especially ones with such deep cultural roots, they deserve, like, respect.
Yeah,
An open mind.
exactly.
Who knows what you might discover.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.